Thank you very much, Anouk, for the opportunity to present the changes and also the stability in the measurement of formal education in PIAAC. And also thanks to Tim for preparing the ground so well. To start with, I think that's all fairly obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Formal education is probably the central background variable in the PIAAC background questionnaire, because it is pretty much what countries do and institutionalize to further skills and to bring skills to people. It is an important mediator in the intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage as well. It is related to social background. So people from lower backgrounds very often have lower educational attainment in the end, and also then lower skills, which relates to important questions of inequalities of opportunity. As I said, skill formation is the main goal of formal education. So these are extremely closely linked concepts. And then we also are often interested in the social and economic outcomes of both skills and formal education. And in order to separate what is due to cognitive skills and what's due to formal education, because the effects are not always the same, we need to measure both well. So measurement quality is of crucial importance for formal education. To give a brief outline of my talk, firstly, I will talk about conceptual innovations in the PIAAC-BQ relating to formal education, which mainly have the aim to deepen our understanding of the role of formal education in skill formation and the effects of skills, but also in the assessment of inequalities of opportunity. So I will briefly talk about the innovation in the concepts that are covered by the BQ, as well as the degree of differentiation in which formal education is measured. Secondly, I will look into some methodological innovation in dealing with two challenges in the measurement of formal education PIAAC. These two challenges are firstly the cross-national comparability, which affects all cross-national surveys, basically. But in PIAAC now, since we want to have comparability also with cycle 1, of course, over time, comparability is another challenge that has to be fulfilled. And I will therefore look into the solutions to approach the challenges, which are innovation in the cross-national coding framework, innovation in the development of the nationally adapted education measures, which Tim also just referred to already, and then innovation in the resulting comparable education variables, which is most interesting for data users at the end. So turning to conceptual innovations. Formal education in PIAAC, the main concept is really educational attainment, which is the highest educational qualification that the respondent has obtained. But there's also several secondary concepts, which you may already know from PIAAC Cycle 1, educational enrollment, so the qualification currently pursued for those who are currently in education, incomplete education, which is the last educational qualification pursued but not obtained, if that ever took place, and education required to get the current or the last job, so the education mismatch questions in section D and E. There is a new concept introduced in cycle 2, which is the educational pathway, which measures all educational qualifications that were obtained before the highest qualification to find out more of the effects, whether how people got to their highest qualification has an impact on their skills and on their later outcomes, and also whether this is related to their social background. So for educational pathways, this was a measurement that was also requested by the board of participating countries. There was an interest across countries to really deepen our understanding here in terms of skill formation across countries and the role of education systems in sorting people into the labor market. And the status quo is a bit like that we have little comparative knowledge on the effects of educational pathways on attainment, on skills, and other outcomes. So the development was supported by an OECD expert group before the current cycle started. It was, however, not covered in the mixed methods pretest that Tim just mentioned, because this development of the items was still ongoing at that time. And the field trial version, however, was validated in the field trial data analysis. So the revised measure that is employed in the main survey, which is placed right after the question on highest qualification, is which other qualifications on this card, there's a show card used for the attainment questions, did you obtain before your highest qualification? Please start at the top and name all that apply. So This will result in a long series of dummy variables of all educational qualifications that people could have obtained. And I will later say a bit more about the variables that can be produced to this. But so conceptually, this is what has been added to cycle 2. The second innovation in terms of the conceptual coverage of formal education is the increased differentiation of the measures. The cycle 1 coding scheme had 12 categories with 2 not further specified codes and was based on the International Standard Classification of Education from 1997. While the cycle 2 coding scheme has 23 categories plus 6, catch all categories that otherwise wouldn't be needed. And it's based on the International Standard Classification of Education 2011. And here you see already that we have a change in the underlying classification, which doesn't make the trend comparisons easier, but I will talk about that in a minute as well. So the cycle 1 coding scheme is simpler because it does not reflect tracks in lower secondary education. This was added in cycle 2. And also the program orientation, so whether education is general or vocational, wasn't covered consistently in the cycle 1 coding scheme, even though it's a highly relevant distinction for inequalities of opportunity, for skill formation, and for outcomes. And if you want to separate the influence of formal education versus skills, if you don't measure whether education is general or vocational, you may end up having effects of education in your skill measures, actually. So this is hopefully going to help to disentangle processes more clearly in empirical analysis. The increased differentiation of the coding scheme is not only motivated by the revision of the International Standard Classification of Education, because but what is really been added for cycle 2 is that we have the distinction of general and vocational education across all ISCED levels where it applies, and that was not the case in cycle 1. So here is the coding scheme that was used in cycle 1, which is already fairly detailed compared to many other international surveys, of course. And here you find the coding scheme that we use for cycle 2. The dimension of access to higher level programs or program destination is like in cycle 1, also the differentiation of ISCED level 0 that increased in ISCED 2011 compared to ISCED 97 was not taken over because it doesn't really have much relevance for PIAAC. But what we have taken, the change is to look at tracks in secondary education, which is actually not part of ISCED, but it's really important for skill development and PIAAC. So this was added beyond ISCED, but then the reflection of general vocational education at levels 3 to 5, as well as the reflection of academic or professional education at levels 6 and 7 was taken over, but not at level 8, because for doctoral education, we have too few respondents to really make that worthwhile. And it's quite rare to have professional PhDs. Now let me turn to methodological innovations. As I said earlier, there's 2 challenges here that we need to deal with: comparability across participating countries because of differences in educational systems, institutions, and qualifications, but also in the understanding of concepts to be measured. And secondly, we have the comparability over time between cycle 1 and cycle 2, where we have changes in educational systems over time. So we cannot just use the same instruments that were used 10 years earlier. And also the tools for rendering education data comparable, such as ISCED and the ISCED mappings, they also changed, and that had to be taken into account. The solution here is to use a specific harmonization approach, where firstly, in a first step, a cross-national coding framework with internationally defined education categories is developed, and you've seen that in an earlier slide already, referring to the increased differentiation compared to cycle 1. Then the design of nationally adapted education measures in such a way that comparable data across countries and over time can be derived in data processing, because we cannot just use the same questionnaire instruments across countries given the different education systems. And then the production of comparable education variables as an output that data users can then use in their empirical analysis. This approach is called ex-ante output harmonization, and basically the approach hasn't changed compared to cycle 1 at all, but in various details there were innovations, of course. So again, as I said, the coding framework is based on ISCED 2011, and you don't need to understand or see all the details in here. I just want to say that we made some innovations in optimizations in that coding framework for the purposes of PIAAC to better allow the ordering of education categories by expected skills, because that's what wasn't well a matter for the ISCED 2011 codes. But I will not talk about the details of what we did, but we can discuss that later if you like. Definitely the scheme that was developed allows the derivation of the official ISCED codes as well as the PIAAC Cycle 1 codes. So here you see the detailed official ISCED codes on the left, which have also very long labels. It's a 3-digit code. And for PIAAC, we developed a 4-digit code where we precede the ISCED code by numbers 1 to 3 for the broad ISCED levels, low, medium, and high, to just allow deriving that by truncating the code. The second digit is the main level of ISCED, which corresponds to the first official ISCED code. And then we have program destination and program orientation, so that we can best order our categories by expected skills. And here just the comparison between the PIAAC Cycle 1 coding framework and the Cycle 2 one. Again, you see the increased differentiation, but also that it's possible to derive this to obtain longitudinal comparability. So nationally adapted education measures were developed also in a multi-step process. So first of all, the international coding scheme had to be documented and described. And also the development process for the nationally adapted education measures in harmonization guidelines. And then we produced in the consortium an education consultation template, which was pre-filled with the information from Cycle 1. So also here, the Cycle 1 measures were the starting point. And then the development of the country-specific education categories was discussed and agreed in a consultation process between country and consortium, which sometimes was quite fast, but sometimes also took quite long. And that's definitely an innovation compared to Cycle 1. It's also a fairly well-documented process, so we can see how certain decisions came about. Then the third step here for the harmonization, and that's important for data users specifically, is the production of comparable education variables and what will be in the files at the end. And here, going from the very detailed to the less detailed coding schemes, there will be the 4-digit PIAAC Cycle 2 coding scheme variables, that also the trend variable with PIAAC Cycle 1, and the respective derived variables, probably also the ones that even linked to further international assessments, which can be derived from the Cycle 1 coding scheme already. And then the official ISCED 2011 can also be coded, of course, in various versions, because there's various ways in which you can aggregate this. The most commonly used is the first digit main level, from really less than primary education to doctoral level. But that means that there will be lots of education variables, and we still have to discuss which ones should actually be in the file and which ones we can provide code for, or how that should be handled in practice. Because we have these education variables for each concept related to formal education, the ones that I showed earlier, like current education, dropout, educational requirements. So since the educational pathway consists of a series of dummy variables, and this is all new to the consortium as well, we had to develop specific derived variables to aggregate the information across the educational career, because what we basically want to know is the types of educational careers that respondents followed, and not necessarily a accumulation of dummy variables of what qualifications they took. So we have developed several indicators and validated them with the field trial data. That's work that was done at ROA. And the definition of the items were, for example, the track that the respondent completed at ISCED level 2 in case of a tracked lower education system, which is a number of countries in PIAAC, but quite a lot of countries have, of course, also comprehensive education systems. So here that's not so relevant. And then whether the respondent completed any vocational or professional education in their education pathway, whether they have completed crucial academic or general qualifications, or the optional ISCED level 4. And other indicators could still be added to that list. So to summarize, PIAAC Cycle 2 formal education variables substantially increase the analysis potential compared to Cycle 1 because of the added differentiation in a detailed coding scheme, most notably the consistent distinction of vocational and general education across ISCED levels, and the added concept of educational pathways to get more background on how people came to their highest qualification. It will still be broadly comparable to Cycle 1 data, and it may also have a higher international comparability because of the very detailed consultation process with countries. However, PIAAC cannot solve some problems that result from weaknesses of the official ISCED mappings and definitions, which we just have to base our work on because that's what's the common practice in international surveys. There are some doubts on the validity of the ISCED mappings, so how individual countries apply ISCED criteria to national qualifications, which would reduce comparability across countries to some degree. And also the ISCED mappings for specific qualifications may have changed between Cycle 1 and Cycle 2, which to some degree threatens longitudinal comparability. But since we are basing our coding in PIAAC on the current ISCED mappings, that's pretty hard to avoid. But hopefully it's not a major problem anyway. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm really curious about the research that will come out of the increased measurement detail that we will have for Cycle 2. Thank you very much.